Hello. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And in a conversation I was having today, someone whipped out the word titillating on me. It turned into one of those situations where the person's still talking, but I'm completely tuned out and fixated on something completely different. And hopefully I'm not a weirdo and I'm the only one that does that. But for real, titillating is not a word that real people use, right? I know a handful of people lose their minds when they hear the word moist. But why isn't titillating given the moist treatment? Moist is like the Nickelback of words. No one seems to like moist and no one really knows why. At this point, I'm just saying it because I know the effect that it has on people. Moist. Okay, I'm done. Probably. If today's the first day that you're listening to 10-Minute Murder, I'm glad you're here, and you walked into a weird one, obviously. But as we're going with this story, make sure you hit subscribe at some point. That way, when you become a subscriber, you don't miss any of the future episodes of 10-Minute Murder. And you can always connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. You'll find all those links in the show notes of this episode, as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now to today's story. How far do you think you would go to prevent someone from sharing your most embarrassing secret? In the case of Mark Redwine, his secret wasn't just embarrassing. It was completely disgusting, but he made sure it would never see the light of day. But Mark made one crucial mistake. He had taken photos of himself engaging in this fetish. In the photos, Mark could be seen wearing women's lingerie, a wig, and makeup, while eating something that appeared to be human feces out of a diaper. He was careful with the photos, which he kept on his computer, but not careful enough. Mark had divorced Elaine, Corey and Dylan's mother, and he was currently engaged in a vicious custody battle. The last thing he needed was for his kids to turn against him, but that's exactly what happened. Dylan and Corey were understandably disgusted by the images, but Corey took photos of the photos just in case the boys decided to confront their father or show the pictures to their mom. Dylan tried not to think about what he had seen in the photos, but those photos had caused his relationship with his dad to become strained. When he went to visit his father in November 2012, he asked Corey to send him copies of the pictures so that he could confront Mark in person. His mom Elaine was worried about Dylan's visit to see his father in the rugged part of La Plata County where he lived. She didn't know about the photos, but she'd noticed how anxious and upset Dylan had been around his dad over the past year. But she didn't have the option to forbid him from going. Her attorney assured her that if she prevented Dylan from visiting Mark, she might face prosecution. Had she known about the photos, it might have been a different situation. At the time of Dylan's visit, Mark already knew that at least one of his children had seen the photos. Corey had revealed that he'd seen the photos during an argument with Mark and used this knowledge to antagonize his dad, sending a text that read, quote, "Hey beautiful, you are what you eat. Look in the mirror." It was the 18th of November 2012 when Mark picked up Dylan from the Durango La Plata County Airport. It wasn't a heartfelt reunion. In fact, the airport's CCTV cameras showed that the pair barely interacted at all. Dylan didn't want to stay with his father that night and asked if he could have a sleepover with a friend, but Mark said no. Dylan texted his friend instead, saying that he would come over to hang out the next morning. The last text message Dylan Redwine ever sent was at 9:37 p.m. that night. Nobody, except for his father, would ever see him again. The next morning, Dylan's friend sent him a text asking where he was, but there was no reply. Mark told the authorities that he left home early that morning to do errands, and when he got back home, a half-eaten bowl of cereal was left on the table, and the TV was still playing Nickelodeon. But there was no sign of Dylan at all. Dylan's mom, Elaine, didn't believe this story for 1 second. Investigators and locals came together to search the sprawling woods and alpine terrain that surrounded Mark's house, but there was no sign of Dylan. While volunteers and search and rescue teams combed through the woods in the area, there was one person who did not join them, Mark Redwine. Instead of searching for his missing son, Mark turned off his house lights at 11 p.m. and went to bed. At Mark's trial, This is what the prosecution had to say about his behavior that night. Quote, "At a time when most people would have been out in the woods with a flashlight, a time when most people would know to leave the light on in case a child was lost in the woods, at 11 p.m., the defendant's house went dark." That night, Mark Redwine knew something that the search party and investigators did not. Dylan was already dead. During the early days of the investigation, a second ex-wife of Mark's came forward to talk to investigators. She told them that during their divorce, Mark had told her that he'd rather kill the kids than let her have custody of them. Her being Mark and Corey's mother, Elaine. She also remembered a conversation with her ex-husband that chilled her to the core. He told her that if he ever killed someone, he'd dispose of the body in the mountains. More than half a year later, this statement would come back to haunt. It was the 28th of June 2013 when human remains were found 8 miles away from Mark's house. The location of the body was significant, as Mark Redwine was familiar with the surrounding area, in particular the ATV trails around Middle Mountain Road, where the remains were found. There was something else significant about the body. Dylan's head was missing, which wouldn't typically occur with an animal attack or death due to exposure. Dylan Redwine's cause of death had to be murder. When cadaver dogs scoured Mark Redwine's house, they indicated the scent of human remains throughout the living room, inside the washing machine, and on specific articles of Mark's clothing. As it turned out, these were the clothes he had been wearing on the 18th of November 2012, the night before Dylan's supposed disappearance. Traces of Dylan's blood were also found in the house, and the same cadaver dog handlers found that cadaver scent was present throughout the Dodge truck that Mark drove. Now that Dylan's body had been found, the cadaver scent and blood began to paint a picture of what happened that night. 2 years passed, and there was still no closure, and Dylan's head was still missing. On the 1st of November 2015, almost 3 years after Dylan's death, his skull was found by hikers more than 1 mile away from where his body was found. Finally, forensics were able to determine the cause of the boy's death. His skull was broken just above his left eye, and there were scratch marks that had likely been caused by a knife wound at around the same time Dylan died. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head. Wildlife experts were consulted and asked whether any animals in the local area could be responsible for the death. The answer was immediate. No. There was no known animal that would pick up a human skull and carry it that far away from the rest of the body. The evidence was clear. No animal had killed Dylan and then dragged his head more than a mile up the mountain. Dylan's blood had been found in Mark's living room, and cadaver dogs indicated that he'd been killed there, then transported in the truck. After a grand jury indictment in July 2017, Mark Redwine was arrested for the abuse and second-degree murder of his son, Dylan. The coronavirus pandemic delayed the beginning of this trial, which finally took place in 2021. The judge remarked on Mark's behavior during the trial, saying, quote, "I have trouble remembering a convicted criminal defendant that has shown such an utter lack of remorse for his criminal behavior." Almost a decade after Dylan's murder, his killer was finally brought to justice. Mark was sentenced to 48 years of jail time, the maximum sentence available to him. While the defense argued that Dylan had still been alive the morning after his visit began, the cadaver scent on the clothes Mark had been wearing the previous night indicated something else. Dylan had been murdered before he even went to bed. To the prosecution, the motive was clear. Dylan had confronted Mark about the sordid pictures he'd found, and Mark had gotten defensive and angry. Somehow, that anger and shame turned into violence and then murder. During the sentencing, the judge summarized the case, speaking directly to Mark. Quote, "First of all, you killed your son, a 13-year-old boy. At 13, he's still a little boy. As the father, it is your obligation to protect your son and keep him from harm. Instead of that, you inflicted enough injury on him to kill him in your living room. After the passion of whatever caused you to act the way you did subsided, you didn't think about Dylan. You thought about yourself. You sanitized the crime scene, you hid Dylan's body, and you went so far to remove his head from the rest of his body." Mark Redwine declined to comment, but his ex-wife Elaine didn't hold back. She said, "Hopefully, he'll die in prison."